Political equality. 1. Two strategies for democracy. A. Democracy and equality. In chapters 1 to 3, I have been studying the idea of equality beginning in a principle, the abstract egalitarian principle, that states the idea in its most abstract form. This principle stipulates that government must act to make the lives of citizens better and must act with equal concern for the life of each member. We reach a useful, practical theory about what equality requires by constructing and testing concrete interpretations, conceptions of that principle, to decide which conception is, all things considered, the best. Of course, the abstract egalitarian principle cannot decide all matters. Government and politics face a variety of issues at every level of abstraction and concreteness that cannot be answered simply by selecting among different interpretations or conceptions of abstract equality. And yet, the influence of the egalitarian principle will be pervasive for any society that accepts it. The preferred interpretation of equal concern will affect not only the design of all fundamental institutions of government, but also the particular decisions each of these institutions makes. Here I consider how the abstract principle bears on the foundational question of the distribution of political power within such a community. What political institutions and processes should an egalitarian community have? I assume that the community is large and complex and so must be governed by the decisions of representative officials rather than by separate decisions, case by case, of the whole community. How would a community based on equal concern choose its representative officials? What powers would these officials have, and what powers would the community as a whole retain? Hello. It may seem self-evident that a society committed to equal concern must be a democracy rather than, for example, a monarchy or dictatorship or oligarchy. Hi. But though it is clear enough how a democracy differs from these other structures of government in general, democracy is itself an idea of great abstraction, if not ambiguity. Democracy requires that officials be elected by the people rather than chosen through inheritance or by a small group of prominent families or electors. But that abstract statement does not decide which officials, if any, should be chosen not by the community as a whole but by sections or groups within it, how powers should be distributed among officials chosen in these different ways, how far elected officials should be permitted or required to appoint other officials to exercise some of their powers, which responsibilities should be held by elected and which by appointed officials, how long officials of either sort should serve, whether their terms of office should be fixed or subject to early termination by those who elected them, how far elected or other officials should themselves be free to change the constitutional arrangements under which officials are elected, whether a constitution should set limits to the powers of officials so that the officials cannot themselves alter these limits, and so forth. Thank you. Though we are all Democrats, these are lively political questions among us, and some are matters of heated controversy. Both Britain and the United States are democracies, but they give very different answers to many of these questions, as do, for some of them, the different states within the United States. So the bare observation that a society committed to equal concern must be a democracy is not much help. That observation is better understood as a restatement of our original question: what form of democracy is most appropriate to an egalitarian society? B. Dependent and detached conceptions. Fine, thank you. We should begin by noticing a crucial distinction between two different approaches to that question. Each offers to interpret our central assumptions about democracy, that a democracy gives political power to the people as a whole rather than to any individual or group, that in a democracy, free speech and expression are protected, and so forth, by providing a general strategy or goal for politics that explains and justifies these central assumptions and also serves as a standard for deciding more detailed and controversial questions, like those I described, about the best form of democracy. The first approach offers as what I shall call a dependent interpretation or conception of democracy, because it supposes that the best form of democracy is whatever form is most likely to produce the substantive decisions and results that treat all members of the community with equal concern. On that view, the main features of a democracy, near universal suffrage, free speech, and the rest, are justified because a community in which the vote is widely held and speech is free is more likely to distribute material resources and other opportunities and values in an egalitarian way. So it recommends, when controversial cases arise about the best detailed form of democracy, that a consequentialist test be used. Which decision of these controversial issues seems most conducive to advancing or protecting these substantive egalitarian goals? The second approach produces what I shall call, in contrast, a detached interpretation or conception of democracy. It insists that we judge the fairness of democratic character of a political process by looking to features of that process alone, asking only whether it distributes political power in an equal way, not what results it promises to produce. Thank you. A detached conception hopes to explain and justify our central assumptions about democracy in that austere way. So it argues that freedom of speech, as well as widespread suffrage, helps to make political power more equal. And it argues, when controversial questions of detail arise about our political process, that these should be resolved by asking which decision is best calculated to improve equality of political power still further. A detached conception of democracy, in other words, supplies an input test. Democracy is essentially a matter of the equal distribution of power over political decisions. A dependent conception supplies an outcome test. Democracy is essentially a set of devices for producing results of the right sort. We must be careful not to confuse that distinction with a different one between two types of outcomes or consequences of a political process. Any democratic political process will have both distributive and participatory consequences. Its distributive consequences will be fixed by the decisions it makes dividing resources into public and private ownership, regulating the acquisition, transfer, and taxation of wealth and other forms of property, and determining when and to what degree people should be compensated for injuries to different forms of property, and how far people should be constrained by the criminal law in using their property or otherwise in acting as they wish. I think you want to know where I am from. I'm from France. A community that accepts the abstract egalitarian principle will aim at distributive decisions that treat people as equals according to the best interpretation of that idea. The participatory consequences of a political process are the consequences that flow from the character and distribution of political activity itself. An egalitarian community will take an interest in at least three kinds of participatory consequence: symbolic, agency, and communal. Symbolic consequences are declarative. The community confirms an individual person's membership as a free and equal citizen by according him or her a role in collective decision. In contrast, it identifies an individual who is excluded from the political process as someone not fully respected or not fully a member. Penal systems have shaped and exploited this symbolic consequence for many countries by attaching loss of vote to criminal conviction. Agency consequences connect politics for each individual to his or her own moral experience. A decent political structure will allow people to participate not merely as voters, but as moral agents who bring reason, passion, and conviction to the role. An egalitarian community will recognize that for many of us, politics present moral issues of greater complexity and importance than any other aspect of our lives, and it will therefore take considerable interest in agency consequences. My YouTube channel, no, I have this YouTube channel since 8 years. Communal consequences are more difficult to describe. From an individual's perspective, there are the various personal consequences of participating in a process whose success and value are communal, in the strong sense that he or she shares fully in the pride or shame of the collective decision. From the collective perspective, they consist in the impact of the political process in nourishing a cohesive and fraternal political community. A pure dependent conception would obviously be a poor interpretation of our common central assumptions about democracy if it ignored participatory consequences and counted only distributional consequences among the substantive goals of an egalitarian state. For a benevolent tyranny, in which none of our assumptions about democracy held, might nevertheless produce a just property scheme, and might otherwise respect the distributional goals of the right conception of equality, indeed it might produce a more egalitarian distribution than a democracy could. But no tyranny could advance the participatory goals any egalitarian community would also aim to secure. So any plausible dependent conception of democracy will recognize the importance of participatory consequences and explain central features of democracy, at least in part, on that ground. It will offer an interpretation of universal suffrage, free speech, and other aspects of democracy that tries to show how these can be understood as helping to advance all the goals of equality taken together, and it will propose changes or improvements to our political process in that spirit. The contrast between the two conceptions of democracy is not, then, that one emphasizes the participatory and the other the distributional consequences of politics, but rather that one ignores while the other makes crucial all the consequences. The dependent conception blurs the distinction between input and outcome, between political equality and the other aspects of egalitarian theory, including its participatory goals. It supposes that these must be developed and inspected together as interlocking parts of an overall conception, no part of which stands entirely on its own. The detached conception, on the other hand, insists on a sharp split between political and all other forms of substantive equality. It treats political equality as a distinct dimension of equality, with its own distinct metric, which is political power. Suppose state electoral districts can be divided in such a way that residents of very poor urban districts could elect more representatives to the state legislature than they could if all districts contained the same number of residents. Assume that this districting arrangement in fact produces more just, because more generally egalitarian, political decisions, and also that it in no way deprives more prosperous residents of moral agency, symbolic recognition, or sense of community. The dependent conception might then endorse the arrangement as furthering its view of democracy, all things considered. But the detached conception must reject the arrangement as undemocratic because it consideredly aims to give some people more political power than others. Each of the two conceptions has been put to polemical use, though in different circumstances. People who dislike the policies of a government add force to their criticism when they can plausibly call it undemocratic. That charge seems essential, or at least particularly helpful, in justifying civil disobedience, for example. See Ronald Dworkin, A Matter of Principle. The dependent conception will be useful as supporting the charge when the policies under attack seem plainly unjust, for, on that conception, critics can appeal to the injustice as evidence that the political process is itself flawed. The detached conception will be useful, on the other hand, when the decision, however just or unjust, does not seem to reflect the will of the majority, as a decision to abandon capital punishment might not. For in that conception, critics can object to the process while professing neutrality about the result. Similarly, in some circumstances, the dependent conception will be more helpful to people anxious to defend legislation as democratic, and in other circumstances, the detached conception will be more helpful to them. My concern here, however, is not with the practical or polemical consequences of the choice between the two conceptions, but with the choice itself, which provides a better interpretation of political equality of democracy. The detached conception, in a pure form, is much the more popular. Almost everyone assumes that democracy means equal voting power among competent adults, that majority rule is therefore the nerve of democracy, and that any failure in majority rule is anti-democratic, whether or not it can be justified by appeal to some principle that overrides democracy in some circumstances. These unspoken assumptions dominate the contemporary debate among American constitutional lawyers about the legitimacy of the United States Supreme Court's power to overrule the decisions of elected legislators, for example. Even the most ardent partisans of that judicial power accept that it is an undemocratic feature of American political practice and must be defended as valuable in spite of that defect. That is, they assume that a detached conception offers the right account of what democracy really is. Part of the appeal of the detached conception lies, no doubt, in its apparent neutrality. In our society, people disagree radically about questions of substantive justice. They disagree, for example, about whether a progressive income tax is official theft, whether laws against pornography are unfair, and whether special benefits for formerly disadvantaged groups are immoral. Divisive issues like these must be settled through the political process, and because the losers in that process will be expected to accept the decision the process reaches, even though they think it unjust, it seems fair that each citizen have equal control over what the decision is. In contrast, the dependent conception multiplies division. Because people have very different ideas about which substantive decisions are egalitarian in the abstract sense, about which decisions treat people with equal concern, they are likely, for that reason, to have very different ideas about which political procedures and institutions are genuinely democratic on the dependent conception. We must not exaggerate this objection to the dependent conception. On both conceptions, the character of democracy is controversial because, as we shall see, the question of how political power should be measured to decide whether it is equal is itself controversial. The difference is rather this. On the dependent conception, controversial questions of substance may well reappear in much the same form as controversial questions about process. Political theorists and philosophers must develop and defend comprehensive theories embracing both substance and procedure at the same time. But on the detached conception, controversies about process, if they break out at all, are more likely to be different controversies. So theorists who accept that conception can develop and defend discrete theories of democracy without touching substantive issues, and then propose that the latter be resolved through the democratic procedures they recommend. I shall argue that in spite of its popularity and its apparent advantages, a detached conception of democracy cannot be successful in a pure form. We must reject it in favor of either a mixed conception of democracy, which draws features from both a detached and dependent strategy, or a pure dependent conception. I shall describe the main outlines of a pure dependent conception, which I believe provides the most attractive choice, and then consider the important political controversy I mentioned: is judicial review undemocratic, as an illustration and test of that conception. 2. What is equality of power? A. Vertical and horizontal dimensions. Equal voting power is not an inevitable or even a likely feature of a dependent conception of democracy. As our distracting example demonstrated, a scheme that does not aim at equality of political power may offer a better prospect of achieving the distributive goals of equality than a scheme that does, and may even, as we shall see later, provide a better prospect of realizing the participatory goals as well. But a detached conception of democracy must take equality of power to be fundamental. For if political equality is a separate, independent dimension of equality, then power is the only intelligible metric for that dimension. An egalitarian political process must be a process that distributes political power equally. The appealing argument for the detached conception I described, that if substantive issues of justice are disputed within a society, each citizen should have an equal role in the resolution of those disputes, assumes that any detached conception will have just that feature. But what is equality of political power? How is political power to be measured? Under what circumstances is it equal? These questions will occupy us for several pages, but we should notice, first, that any adequate theory of political equality must compare political power along two dimensions. Not only horizontally, but comparing the power of different private citizens or groups of citizens, but also vertically, by comparing the power of private citizens with individual officials. If democracy is a matter of equal political power, both dimensions must figure in the accounting. Horizontal equality of power is hardly enough to provide anything we would recognize as a genuine democracy. In totalitarian dictatorships, private citizens have equal political power. None. Cynical pretend democracies with a single political party are usually scrupulous in providing each citizen with one and only one vote for that party, so the vertical dimension must come into play. It seems incredible, however, that any genuine vertical equality of power could exist even in apparently genuine democracies like Britain and the United States. How could our political structures and practices be revised, short of destroying representative government altogether, so as to give every citizen of voting age the same power over national affairs as a junior congressman, let alone as much as the president? So a detached conception of democracy, based on equality of power, might seem caught in a dilemma at the start. If it insists on horizontal equality only, equality among the governed, its most stringent requirements might be satisfied by plainly undemocratic tyrannies. If it demands vertical equality as well, then it is wholly unrealistic. Ouais, c'est ça. B. Impact and influence. We must bear in mind that threatened dilemma when we consider what equality of power might mean. We should distinguish two interpretations: equality of impact and equality of influence. The intuitive difference is this: someone's impact in politics is the difference he can make, just on his own, by voting for or choosing one decision rather than another. Someone's influence, on the other hand, is the difference he can make not just on his own, but also by leading or inducing others to believe or vote or choose as he does. We need a somewhat more technical account of impact and influence than that, however, because we want to compare the political impact or influence of different people. So let us define degree of impact and influence in the following way, which makes use of the idea of subjective probabilities. Suppose you know everything there is to know about the political structure of a particular community, including the voting rights of all citizens, the jurisdictional structures of representation, and the constitutional power of each official. But you know nothing about the non-constitutional powers of charisma or reputation or association or skill or threat or bribe or other advantages that give any one person influence over the political acts of anyone else. You know nothing at the start about the views or opinions or the voting or choosing intentions of anyone about some matter that the political process must soon decide, like, for example, whether to reduce taxes. In these circumstances, you cannot assign any more than an equal probability to the community as a whole's reaching either decision. Now you learn my firm voting or choosing intentions. You learn that I will cast every vote I have against reducing taxes, for instance. By how much should you increase your estimate of the probability of that result? The answer gives my political impact with respect to that decision. We can define political influence in a similar way. Now we suppose you know everything there is to know not only about the constitutional structure of powers and rights, but also about the non-constitutional powers of influence I excluded from your knowledge in the preceding paragraph. Once again, you initially know nothing about anyone's opinion or voting intentions about reducing taxes, and so can assign neither community decision greater probability than the other. Now, when you learn that I oppose tax reduction and will do everything I can to defeat it, the degree to which you should increase the probability of that decision in virtue of that information states my political influence over the issue. Of course, we could not hope to make any judgments about equality of power with the precision these definitions seem to suggest. I offer them only to provide some sense for the comparisons that must, in practice, be made more roughly. The distinction between political impact and political influence suggests an escape from the dilemma I described. Obviously, vertical equality of political power is impossible if that means equality of political impact. You would certainly have decreased the subjective probability of tax reduction by an incomparably greater extent. When you learned of my intention to cast any vote I had against it, if you had thought I was a senator rather than an academic lawyer. Indeed, it makes no sense, even as an unattainable ideal, to call for vertical equality of impact in a structure of representative government, because a representative structure is necessarily one in which impact is sharply different from a vertical perspective. But it does make sense to call for vertical equality as an ideal if the equality in question is equality of influence. We can even describe a fully representational system in which equality of influence holds, at least to the degrees of precision to which it can be measured anyway. Suppose that officials accept that they have a duty to vote as a majority of those they represent wish. Suppose that elections are held sufficiently frequently, communication between officials and constituents is good enough, and recall mechanisms sufficiently efficient and inexpensive, so that officials do in fact hold to that duty. In those circumstances, rough vertical equality of influence is realized. Because Senator X will vote for tax reduction when but only when he believes that a majority of his constituents favor it, the information that he would personally prefer a reduction does not increase the probability that he will vote for it any more than the information that any other of his constituents would prefer it increases that probability. So it seems that the detached conception, which takes equality of power to be the sole index of democracy, can succeed as a plausible interpretation of our central assumptions only if it takes equality of power to mean equality of influence, because only that reading would offer a plausible account of the vertical dimension of equality. Now look at the matter from the horizontal perspective. Here, too, it would be implausible to understand equality of power to mean equality of impact, but now for the opposite reason. Equality of impact is not too demanding a goal, but one not demanding enough. Equal impact does require that each competent citizen have a vote and the same vote, and it also requires one person, one vote districting. Equal impact would condemn the districting arrangement I offered as an example earlier, which provides more political impact per person for poor inner city residents. It also condemns the American constitutional scheme for electing senators, which gives each resident of Wyoming much more impact over decisions the Senate takes than each resident of California has. But equality of impact does nothing to justify a central assumption we make about democracy, which is that democracy requires not only widespread suffrage but freedom of speech and association, and other political rights and liberties as well. My impact in politics is no less than yours when special censorship denies me the right to present my views to the public but allows you to do so. We need to reach beyond the idea of equal impact to equal influence even to begin to explain why censoring the views of some denies equality of political power. We need to reach beyond equal impact, moreover, to explain a serious complaint against American democracy most people accept to some degree. That some private citizens have disproportionately more political power than others because they are richer or control media or for some similar reason. That is a complaint not about unfair impact but about unfair influence. No Rockefeller who votes in your jurisdiction has any greater impact on political decisions than you do. His vote counts for no more than yours. All this confirms that what we gathered by considering equality of power on the vertical dimension. On the horizontal dimension as well, the equal power that the detached conception demands cannot be equality of impact. If the idea of equal political power is to provide a conception of democracy sufficiently comprehensive to detach that conception from substantive aims, then equal power must be understood to mean equal influence. C. Should influence be equal? But is equality of influence really an attractive ideal? Would we not hesitate to improve vertical equality of influence in the way in which we just saw this to be possible, by insisting that officials always act in whatever way a majority of their constituents wished, and adopting electoral devices that would punish those who do not? Of course, even if we did schedule elections frequently enough and provide recall mechanisms sufficiently terrifying to make officials generally obedient, we could not make them always so, if only because they would sometimes be mistaken about what a majority of their constituents wanted, or because in their last planned terms they might depart on frolics of their own. But do we want to come even as close as we can to making sure of their obedience? That question will remind you of Burke's famous letter to the sheriffs of Bristol, in which he denied any responsibility, even in principle, to vote for what those who elected him favoured. See Edmund Burke, a letter to John Farr and John Harris, sheriffs of the city of Bristol, on the affairs of America, in the writings and speeches of the Right Honourable Edmund Burke, originally published in 1777. History has generally credited his opinion, even though depressingly few officials seem actually to follow it. Nor do we seem to object to parts of our constitutional structure that are now obstacles to vertical equality of influence. Senators are elected for six-year terms. Presidents and all other elected federal officials are guaranteed fixed terms, no matter how unpopular they become. In England, by contrast, a very unpopular government falls and new elections must be held. Judges have great power. Many are appointed rather than elected, and once appointed, have lifetime tenure, and so on. Someone defending vertical equality of political influence as an ideal might respond to these facts in different ways. He might condemn the features of American practice that impair vertical equality as outrageously undemocratic and call for radical reform. Or he might insist that though these features are indeed undemocratic and unfair, they are justified overall as compromises necessary to achieve other political goals like efficiency and stability. These latter reply, of course, would mark a retreat from a pure detached conception of democracy because it concedes that political institutions should serve goals other than equality of power, and that these other goals are sometimes important enough to justify compromises of political equality. The doubts I mainly want to press here, however, are doubts about equality of influence on the horizontal dimension, where it will seem to most readers, I believe, a much more attractive ideal than it does in the vertical dimension. The main appeal of horizontal equality of influence lies in the conviction that it is unfair that some private citizens have much more influence in politics than others, just because they are much richer. But we can explain that intuition in two ways. We can indeed explain it as resting on the assumption that any great lapse from equality of influence among private citizens is a serious lapse in democracy. Or we can explain it in a way that does not appeal to equality of influence as a general ideal at all. We can say, for example, that it is unjust that some people have as much money as a Rockefeller because that violates the distributive principles of equality, and then add that the disproportionate political influence their wealth gives them is a particularly deplorable consequence of the injustice because it allows them, among other things, to perpetuate and multiply their unfair advantages. These two ways of objecting to a Rockefeller's political influence are, of course, very different. The first is insensitive to the source of his disproportionate influence. It supposes that aggregate influence from all sources must be equal. The second makes no assumptions about aggregate influence. It condemns the Rockefeller's influence only because of the particular source of that influence. We can contrast the two objections by imagining a world in which the first would hold but the second would not. Suppose the distributional goals of equality were met, but some people still had more influence in politics than others. They might have more influence for a variety of reasons, but I shall assume reasons unobjectionable in themselves, because we are considering whether we should object to unequal influence as such. They might have decided to spend more of their initially equal wealth in political campaigns, for example, than others have. Or they might have invested more in study and training, which made others more likely to consult them or listen to their advice. Or they might have led lives of such conspicuous achievement or virtue that others trust them more or are more ready to follow them. The first form of objection to Rockefeller's influence would nevertheless apply to such people. We would regard the greater influence of politically motivated or experienced or charismatic people as a defect in political organization, and take whatever steps we could to eliminate or reduce it. But the second form of the objection would lapse unless we had some other reason, quite independent of any assumption that political influence should be equal, for objecting to a situation in which some people are more politically motivated or trained or charismatic than others. Which form of objection is more precise? When we object to the distribution of power in our society, is power really the root of our complaint? Or are we really objecting to other, independently unjust features of our economic or political or social organization in a forceful way, by calling attention to a very unfortunate consequence of these features? Consider the common and wholly justified complaint that women have too little power of all kinds in most societies. Someone who takes that view might think that social organization is defective unless the average woman has the same influence over affairs, measured in some specified way, as the average man does. But someone else who makes the same complaint might mean something very different. Not that men and women should, as a matter of right, have the same influence on average, but that the smaller influence women now have is the result of a combination of economic injustice, stereotype, and other forms of oppression and prejudice, some of which, perhaps, are so fundamental as to be carried in the community's culture. The difference between these two positions emerges most clearly, once again, if we try to imagine a society in which economic, social, and cultural discrimination against women has been removed. If the average power of men and women is unequal in such a society, as it might be in either direction, would that fact, just in itself, count as a defect in social organization? These rhetorical questions are meant to tempt you away from the ideal of equality of power, but I expect that many of you will remain drawn to that ideal, if not in every sphere of life, then at least in politics. I shall therefore try to show how accepting equality of influence as an ideal would conflict with other egalitarian goals, by asking you to consider the steps that would be needed to approach that ideal further once we had corrected the independent injustices that we anyway condemn. I imagined that even in an egalitarian society, differences in interest, commitment, training, and reputation might be sources of differences in political influence. Of course, many people would have a much better education in such a society than they do now, and people who now have no interest in politics because they rightly feel ignored in its processes and excluded from its gains would then be more likely to seek a political life. But I assume that these plainly desirable consequences of a more egalitarian distribution of resources would not wholly eliminate differences in influence from the sources I mentioned. Some people would remain politically much more interested and informed, and much more effective in convincing and leading others. What could we do to iron out these remaining differences in influence, which might well be substantial? By far the most effective means, if that were our only goal, would be to reduce the role of influence in politics overall, that is, to reduce the opportunities citizens have to reflect together on what to urge or do. So long as politics is collectively reflective, in ways we now think admirable, it is inevitable that some citizens will have more influence than others. But we can make politics less reflective only by prohibiting political speech and association in the manner of the most savage totalitarian regimes, and I shall assume that any such prohibition would be unacceptable. A second strategy would be much less effective. We might try to make people less unequal in their political influence by setting a top limit to the funds anyone might invest or spend in education or training for politics or in political campaigns. Limits on campaign expenditures are of course appealing when these compensate for unjust differences in wealth, just as both of the arguments I distinguished earlier object to Rockefeller's disproportionate political influence, so both recommend limits on political expenditure in present circumstances. But if resources were distributed equally, limits on campaign expenditure would be inegalitarian because they would prevent some people from tailoring their resources to fit the lives they wanted, though leaving others, who had less interest in politics, free to do so. I assume in this claim that wealth remains equal so that no small group of very rich people could dominate politics through political contributions or expenditures. See Chapter 10. Such limits would also be perverse, for they would be protecting equality of influence on behalf of those who put a low value on their own influence, but who would have had greater influence if they had valued that higher. A third strategy would be so ineffectual that it is worth mentioning only because the objections to it are instructive. We might try to educate people not to attempt to influence others with respect to political decisions, except in ways that do not rely on special advantages they might have, in experience or commitment or reputation, and also to attempt to resist being influenced by other people whose arguments might have special force traceable to such advantages. People could not succeed in following that advice because in political argument it is impossible to separate dancer from dance. But the suggestion is anyway objectionable because it encourages people deliberately to ignore what, by hypothesis, seem to them the best arguments, the most convincing reasons for taking up or working for one political cause, rather than another. Indeed, it encourages them, sometimes deliberately, to pursue what they think would be the worst decision on substantive grounds. Of course, I do not imagine that anyone would actually recommend any of these three strategies. Each is preposterous. But they are preposterous in ways that suggest that equality of influence is incompatible, even in principle, with other attractive aspects of an egalitarian society. Everyone concedes, of course, that conflicts might arise between equality of influence and distributional equality. We anticipated that possibility early in this chapter in considering the the districting arrangement that gave the inner city poor greater political impact, at least over certain issues, in order to achieve a more egalitarian distribution of resources. However, that kind of conflict is only contingent. There is nothing in the character of equality of influence as an ideal that seems at war with distributive equality. But there is a more pervasive and fundamental conflict between that ideal and participatory goals that it would seem natural for an egalitarian society to endorse. An egalitarian society wishes its citizens to engage in politics out of a shared and intense concern for the justice of the results, out of a shared and intense concern that distributional decisions treat everyone with equal concern. It encourages citizens to take pride or shame in the community's success or failure as if it were their own. It aims at that communal goal of political activity.
Preposterous. Preposterous. Preposterous.
Preposterous. Absurd. The ideal of equal influence defies that ambition, however. When people are fastidious not to have too much influence, or jealous that they do not have enough, their collective concern is only a matter of show. They continue to think of political power as a discrete resource rather than a collective responsibility. An egalitarian society also cherishes an agency goal for political activity, that citizens should have as much scope for extending their moral life and experience into politics as possible. But people who accept equality of influence as a political constraint cannot treat their political lives as moral agency, because that constraint corrupts the cardinal premise of moral conviction, that only truth counts. Political campaigning under some self-imposed limit of influence would not be moral agency, but only a pointless minuet of deference. D. Taking stock. Equality of impact cannot furnish a pure detached conception of democracy. It asks much too much on the vertical dimension of politics, and much too little on the horizontal. Equality of impact may well play an important role in a mixed, detached, and dependent conception, as a goal to be sought when and as other considerations permit. And, as we shall see, it has a role to play in any plausible pure dependent conception. But if a pure detached conception is to succeed, it must use influence rather than impact as the metric of political power. Equality of influence, however, does not seem desirable as an exclusive standard on the vertical dimension. It would require too much sacrifice of official independence and other values, nor does it seem desirable as an exclusive standard on the horizontal dimension. We should, of course, remedy the distributive injustices that account for a great deal of the inequality in political influence of our own time. But we could not pursue equality of influence beyond remedying those distinct injustices, because the means we should have to use would violate other features of a desirable egalitarian society that seem more important. It follows that we cannot maintain a pure detached conception of democracy. Should we therefore construct a mixed conception in which equality of influence figures as an attractive, though unattainable, ideal, compromised by consequentialist considerations drawn from a dependent strategy, we would then have a deep dilemma to deplore in the abstract principle of equality. We would have decided that we cannot treat people as equals unless we make their political influence equal, and that we cannot treat them as equals if we do. But why should we accept equality of influence as a discrete ideal? What is to be said for it? I suggested one argument early in this chapter, and we should return to it now. It seems unfair to ask people to accept substantive results they think wrong unless they have had as great a role in the decision as anyone else. When I first advanced that argument, as explaining the intuitive appeal of the detached conception of democracy, we had not yet distinguished the two modes of power, impact and influence. The argument has some force as an argument for equality of impact, and that force is preserved in the limited argument for that form of equality that we will discover later in a dependent conception of democracy. But the argument fails altogether as an argument for equality of influence. It seems quite irrelevant, when I am asked to accept a majority decision I opposed, whether my opponents were more skillful in arguing than I was. I cannot plead my lack of influence as showing the illegitimacy of the vote against me unless I can trace my lack of influence to a source that is itself illegitimate. We are left, I believe, with only one argument for equality of influence, that we must accept it as an ideal and must therefore settle for a mixed conception of democracy, because we cannot develop an adequate conception that ignores it. In the remainder of this chapter, one shall take up that challenge by sketching a dependent conception of democracy that provides an important, though limited, place for equality of impact, but none for equality of influence. I hope to show that a dependent conception can account, in a natural and unstrained way, for what we take to be the central features of democracy, and that it can justify those features through principles we can and should use in debates about what democracy, in detail, really means. 3. Participatory values. A. Symbolic goals. We must reconstruct and expand the list of substantive political goals that a successful dependent conception of democracy would reflect. We cannot rule out in advance that some of the goals we list will conflict with others, in which case the dependent conception must be in some sense a compromise among these goals. Nevertheless, I shall consider the demands of the different goals separately until conflicts do emerge, if they do. I shall start with participatory goals. The symbolic consequences of a political structure are largely fixed by the assignment of vote, which is a matter of political impact. Elections in large political communities are typically structured by dividing the overall community into electoral districts of different size and character. There are no national undistricted elections in the United States, and such elections are very rare in Britain. We elect officials and decide affairs by states or parliamentary districts, and also by cities and wards and school districts. Equality requires that voting assignments carry a symbolic declaration of equal standing for all. The political decisions that divide the overall political community into districts, and that assign votes which, within each district so created, must not be motivated by, or be capable of interpretation as reflecting, any lower standing of, or less concern for, one citizen as against others. So we have in this symbolic goal a compelling reason for taking a horizontal equality of impact across the political community as a whole as at least the prima facie standard of democratic political structures. But only prima facie, because the symbol goal permits deviations from that standard when these deviations cannot plausibly be understood as reflecting adversely on the standing or importance of those whose impact is made less. History and convention play an important role in applying these considerations in practice. Our own history is such that no deviation from equal impact within a district, no deviation, that is, from equal vote, is tolerable for us. That strict requirement would not necessarily hold in a community whose history showed that unequal voting did not itself display contempt or disregard. We can imagine, for example, a society in which people gain votes as they grow older, or in which people acquire more votes by pursuing a course of study genuinely open to everyone, or something of that sort. But in a society like our own, in which the vote has traditionally been an emblem of responsibility, weight, and stake, any violation of equal vote will reflect a denial of the symbolic attachment equal vote confirms. That is why loss of vote has so often been used as one of the consequences of a criminal conviction. Our history does not give equality of impact the same symbolic role in considering how a large community should be districted into smaller voting jurisdictions. Part of the reason is obvious. For practical reasons, only rough equality of impact could be established by districting decisions, because these could not be mathematically perfect and would in any case become outdated between periodic redistricting efforts. American history, in particular, has furnished dramatic examples of districting decisions in which equality of impact was disdained for reasons obviously not reflecting less concern for those whose political impact was thereby reduced. The scheme of districting that gives citizens of Wyoming more impact than those of California in the Senate was not originally motivated by, nor could it now plausibly be interpreted as reflecting, contempt for the latter or lack of respect for their views. So our history does not condemn, as incompatible with the symbolic goals of equality, districting decisions denying equal impact if these are equally obviously innocent in that way. The districting scheme I imagined earlier, which aims to give inner city poor somewhat more impact than they would otherwise have, is hardly incompatible with those symbolic goals, for example, though that scheme might offend other parts of an attractive dependent conception of democracy. But because the requirement that a districting scheme that imposes significant inequality of impact must not reflect any lack of equal concern is a requirement particularly easy to evade, any attractive dependent conception would insist that a strong and evident case be made for any exemption from the equal impact requirement. Perhaps this is the best justification for the US Supreme Court's one person, one vote decisions. We might understand the court as deciding, as a piece of prophylaxis, that no constitutionally required exceptions should be permitted. C. E. G. Gaffney v. Cummings, Reapportionment Plan of Connecticut General Assembly, challenged under the Equal Protection Clause following the 1970 population census. Reynolds v. Sims, Equal Protection Clause challenge to proposed plan to reapportion voting districts for the two houses of the Alabama legislature. B. Agency values. The agency values of politics are more diffuse and elusive, but there is an obvious connection between these values and free speech and the other political liberties. We cannot make our political life a satisfactory extension of our moral life unless we are guaranteed freedom to express our opinions in a manner that, for us, satisfies moral integrity. Opportunity to express commitment to our convictions is just as important for that purpose as the opportunity to communicate those convictions to others. Indeed, the two often merge. Just as someone denied opportunity to worship according to his or her own lights is denied a foundational part of religious life, so someone denied opportunity to bear witness to his concern for justice, as he understands what the concern requires, finds his political agency stultified, not merely bounded. But the demands of agency go beyond expression and commitment. We do not engage in politics as moral agents unless we sense that what we do can make a difference, and an adequate political process must strive, against formidable obstacles, to preserve that potential power for everyone. It must, that is, ensure a degree of political leverage for each citizen. Districting has a role to play in that ambition, and it is important to notice the difference between mediate and final districting. Districting is mediate when elections pick representatives who together reach a single decision for the political community as a whole, as in the case of statewide elections for the Senate. Districting is final when elections finally decide something for the jurisdiction of the election, as in the case of bond issue referenda. Both give individual citizens in a large county more leverage, though in different ways. Mediate districting gives somewhat more leverage on important issues of national consequence, and so improves moral agency within the community as a whole. Final districting gives more leverage over issues of correspondingly less dramatic consequence. Of course, districting is not the only means an egalitarian political process can and should use to provide leverage. In large districts, or in mediate districts in large nations, the leverage of vote is negligible. So the agency goal of politics can be properly served only by providing everyone enough access to influential media, if he or she wishes, to give each person a fair chance to influence others if he or she can. That, we might say, is the other side of the liberties of free speech and audience, judged from the point of view of agency. In our inegalitarian society, the most prominent source of inequality of access is inequality of wealth. If resources were more equally distributed, leverage would automatically be improved for large numbers of citizens. But if, nevertheless, the economics of the media gave only those who chose to invest or work in that industry access to a political audience, the agency goals of democracy would then require access to be guaranteed or provided in some other way for citizens more generally. Readers will wonder whether I am now introducing, through the idea of leverage and access, the same equality of influence that I rejected before. Moral agency is possible for all citizens in politics only if each has an opportunity to make some difference. In a large district, the opportunity to vote without more may not satisfy this requirement. So the opportunity for influence, and not merely impact, is necessary to agency. But this says nothing about equality of influence. We encountered that latter idea in the course of a very different argument, which we began by assuming that democracy requires equality of power and wondered what that meant. We discovered that it must mean equality of influence, and we grew doubtful about equality of power mainly for that reason. In the present discussion, we encounter the idea of influence in a very different context, in the course of building a dependent conception of democracy. The emphasis is now on the opportunity of some influence, enough to make political efforts something other than pointless, rather than on the opportunity to have the same influence as anyone else has. We design a dependent conception of democracy so that it permits anyone who wishes it enough leverage or engagement to make it possible for him or her to treat politics as an extension of his moral life. That is a threshold notion, and nothing in it takes equality of influence to be an ideal toward which we should strive. So the symbolic values of participation require equality of vote within districts, at least for us, and presume equality of impact across districts. The agency values require liberty and leverage. The communal participatory values send us in a somewhat different direction that I shall not explore here, except by suggesting, cryptically, that a political society improves its members' sense of politics as a joint venture by adopting the right conception of distributive equality, equality of resources, and by insisting, in its substantive political and legal decisions, on the second-order political virtue of integrity. 4. Distributive values. A. Two kinds of issues. We now have some sense of an adequate dependent conception of democracy. It requires equality of vote within districts and presumes equality of impact across them. It requires liberty and leverage. These requirements leave much open. They hardly speak to questions of vertical equality at all. They do not stipulate the size of districts, the form of representation, or which decisions must be left to which class or kind of officials, for example. Now we turn to the distinctly substantive goals of an egalitarian political process. The decisions we believe the process should make about the distribution of resources and opportunities into private ownership, about the use of collective power and resources in public programs of foreign policy, about saving and conservation, and about the other topics of public principle and policy that confront a modern government. How would we design a dependent conception of democracy if we wanted to improve the accuracy of these various decisions? I use that provocative word deliberately. Though it might seem, I don't know what word he's talking about. Though it might seem odd to speak of a decision about whether to raise taxes or to enforce capital punishment or to give aid to the contras as either accurate or inaccurate, accurate, le mot peut-être accurate, alors accuracy, I am supposing that it is sensible to do so, or at least to speak, as people skeptical about right answers to moral questions prefer to do, about a class of better decisions and a class of worse ones. We want our political process, among other things, to be one well designed to make accurate judgments about which decision is best, or at least in the group of better decisions. It is now essential that we notice an important distinction between two types or classes of political decisions, those involving mainly what I shall call choice-sensitive issues, and those involving mainly choice-insensitive ones. Choice-sensitive issues are those whose correct solution, as a matter of justice, depends essentially on the character and distribution of preferences within the political community. The decision whether to use available public funds to build a new sports center or a new road system is typically choice-sensitive. Though a variety of issues may emerge in that decision, from issues of distributive justice to those of sound environmental policy, information about how many citizens want or will use or will benefit directly or indirectly from each of the rival facilities is plainly relevant and may well be decisive. The decision whether to kill convicted murderers or to outlaw racial discrimination in employment, on the other hand, seems choice insensitive. I do not believe that the right decision on these issues depends in any substantial way on how many people want or approve of capital punishment or think racial discrimination unjust. The case against capital punishment, I believe, is just as strong as in a community where a majority of members favor it as in a community of people revolted by the idea. Of course, people will disagree about which issues are choice-sensitive and which, if any, are choice-insensitive. But the second-order question, whether any particular first-order question is choice-sensitive or insensitive, is itself choice-insensitive. It makes no sense to say that a particular question is choice-sensitive, if, but only if, a majority of people think it is or want it to be. Some readers will recognize, in the distinction between choice-sensitive and insensitive issues, a distinction I have described differently in the past as one between issues of policy and issues of principle. I do believe that what I call issues of policy are choice-sensitive, and that issues of principle are choice-insensitive. But I do not assume that in the present discussion. I assume only that readers will agree that some political issues are choice insensitive, even if they disagree about which issues are. B. Accuracy, impact, and influence. A political process that distributes political impact roughly equally is generally better suited to the accurate decision of choice-sensitive issues than one that distributes it very unequally. If the question arises whether a new sports stadium or a new road system will better match the needs and desires of the population as a whole, then a process in which the wishes of most people are recorded directly, as through a referendum, or indirectly through the decisions of representatives elected and re-elected by popular majorities, is obviously better, at least in ordinary circumstances, than a process in which only a small and possibly unrepresentative section of the community participates in any way. That argues in the direction of horizontal equality of impact with respect to choice-sensitive decisions within the community affected. It does not argue for complete equality of impact, however, even as an ideal, because it is easy to imagine variations in impact that would seem to improve ex-ante accuracy in the decision of choice-sensitive issues. The residents of sparsely settled sections of a country or state, for example, might have interests special to them that would be neglected or overridden in an election in which equality of impact was enforced to as great a degree as is technically possible. C'est toujours en course. Over the course of many such elections or political decisions, their interests would be less well served than any plausible account of accuracy in the decision of choice-sensitive issues would allow. We might do better, in deciding such issues, to use some judicious gerrymandering in which the impact of each citizen of a sparse area would be greater, one by one, than the impact of an individual citizen of a denser area. Yeah. We might do better for the ex-ante accuracy of choice-sensitive decisions, in other words, by adopting districting decisions that preserved the equality of vote within districts that we need for symbolic reasons, but that reduced equality of impact in the ways just described, by a deliberate choice for special and limited inequalities. My former example about districting in favor of poor inner-city residents is only another case of the same strategy. What about equality not of impact but of influence? How far would we aim at equality of influence as a device for improving ex-ante accuracy in the decision of choice-sensitive issues? Of course, we would want to prevent false advertising and other forms of deception whose likely effect would be to hide facts people need in order to judge whether a particular program would be in their own interests. We would also want to prevent manipulations designed to create tastes that are at odds with people's more foundational ambitions or values. But we can justify constraints necessary to these ends without appealing to equality of influence as itself an ideal, and other features of choice-sensitive decision counsel against that ideal as a device for accuracy. For just as some people or groups use their political influence to deceive or manipulate, so others use their influence to teach, reform, and ennoble, to suggest ranges of value and ambition that might, for example, lead some people to favor a theater over both a sports stadium and a road system who would not otherwise have even considered the choice. We have no general reason to read the political forum of the latter forms of influence, and we therefore have no general reason to try even to achieve as much equality of influence as possible. We must target the constraints we design to bad or inappropriate influence by reducing the importance of wealth in politics, and by encouraging the forms of political debate in which deception is most likely to be exposed, rather than by taking even the minimal steps we might to ensure that no one's views turn out to be more moving than anyone else's. There is much more to be said about ex-ante accuracy in choice-sensitive decisions, but our concern here is schematic, and we should therefore turn instead to the second part of our accuracy study, ex-ante accuracy in the decision of choice-insensitive issues. We do not, of course, have the argument for widespread dispersal of political impact here that we had in the case of choice-sensitive issues. For by definition, the accurate decision of choice-insensitive issues does not depend on information a wide poll can be expected to provide. If we were to accept certain assumptions, cardinal among which is the assumption that people are on average more likely than not to decide choice-insensitive issues correctly, Then we would conclude that the more people who voted on a particular such issue, assuming equal impact, the more likely it would be that the majority would vote for the right side. See Louis Konhauser and Lawrence Sager, Unpacking the Court, Yale Law Journal, 82. But there is no a priori ground for accepting those assumptions. Whether I think it more likely than not that any particular person will reach the right decision about capital punishment depends on what I think the right answer is, not on any general observations about the average man or woman's skill in moral philosophy. Où ça? Some famous political philosophers have thought that the right answer to all choice-insensitive issues will be produced by a general will that emerges from the people as a whole under favorable circumstances. Rousseau? But that idea, whatever one might think of its metaphysical basis, is not an argument for anything approaching equality in political power. Indeed, the idea of a general will is antagonistic to any concern for either the impact or the influence of individual citizens one by one. Those forms of equality are important, if at all, only when disagreement must be resolved, but a general will assumes the emergence, through discussion, not log rolling, of unanimity, or at least of a decision that wins by a knockout, not on points. Bah, general will. Je pense qu'il fait référence à Rousseau, là. I conclude that we have no reason to think, ex ante, that anything approaching equality of either impact or influence, in either the vertical or horizontal dimension of politics, is best... Geared? C'est quoi ça, ce mot? Attends. Engrené, je connais même pas en français.
Geared.
Geared. D'accord. Engrené. Geared. Look, I conclude that we have no reason to think, ex ante, that anything approaching equality of either impact or influence, in either the vertical or horizontal dimension of politics, is best geared to produce right answers to choice-insensitive issues across the board. But, as we noticed, the participatory and other substantive goals of egalitarian politics are not so indiscriminate. They do argue for particular structures. The symbolic goals argue for equal vote within districts, the agency goals for liberty and leverage, and the choice-sensitive accuracy goal for a large degree of equality of impact. Oui. So the right overall dependent conception of democracy has already taken on fairly concrete shape, and we should therefore use the same structure to decide choice-insensitive issues as well, unless two conditions are met. We must have some positive reason to think that a different procedure would considerably improve ex-ante accuracy in deciding choice-insensitive issues, and these different procedures must not outrage any of the other goals of egalitarian politics we have canvassed. It would be outrageous, for example, to suggest that only lawyers and moral philosophers should be allowed to vote on choice-insensitive matters, because that suggestion, in addition to its other manifest effects, wholly ignores the symbolic goals that require equality of vote. I shall... Prends ça dans ta tronche, américain. I shall briefly discuss, in the final section, a special arrangement for the decision of certain choice-insensitive issues that I believe does satisfy the two conditions I described, and that should therefore be part of our developed dependent conception of democracy. But I should first take up a question I postponed earlier, which the preceding paragraph invites us to consider now. Do the different goals a dependent conception should recognize conflict, so that we must compromise or subordinate some of these to others? It makes a difference whether we have in mind ex post or ex ante conflict. It might well turn out that enforcing equality of vote on some occasion on some issue, whether to build a new sports stadium, for example, will lead to the wrong decision, though a more restricted electorate would in fact for some reason have produced the right one. The possibility of such ex post conflict does not require any compromise or subordination of values in the design of political institutions, however, unless the conflict is also ex ante, that is, unless we could have designed a different set of institutions that would have made the wrong decision of such issues less likely, but at the cost of enduring competing symbolic or other values. The question whether a dependent conception must acknowledge the more serious ex ante form of conflict is necessarily complex and can hardly be decided in advance of a more detailed examination of institutional design than we are now undertaking. But nothing has yet emerged in our limited study here to show that ex ante conflict between the different goals a dependent conception should recognize is inevitable. In that respect, the dependent conception of democracy seems to stand on firmer ground than the more popular, detached conception we first studied. For as we noticed, the ex ante conflict that conception embraced between equality of influence and the participatory goals of egalitarian politics is evident, profound, and unavoidable. Five, constitutionalism and principle. I shall close, as a kind of recapitulation, by considering an important example of how accuracy in the decision of choice in sensitive issues might be improved through special arrangements, at the cost of equality of both impact and influence, but without introducing ex ante conflict with any of the other goals we studied. In the United States, and increasingly in other countries as well, courts test legislation against their understanding of what their nation's constitution requires and hold legislation invalid if it offends that understanding. That practice strikingly compromises vertical equality of both impact and influence. A few judges have profoundly greater power than anyone else over the decision whether, for example, capital punishment or affirmative action or laws restricting abortion are to be permitted. That is why judicial review is generally regarded as undemocratic, even by its sometime friends and even by its passionate admirers. If we adopt a dependent conception of democracy, however, rather than a detached conception that makes democracy a matter of vertical and horizontal equality of impact or influence, it is far from evident that judicial review is in any way an undemocratic institution. For a more thorough analysis and evaluation of this argument, see Dworkin, Freedom's Law. We must test the democratic character of judicial review by asking whether it does any violence to the ideals of a dependent conception we have been developing. I have not before mentioned what we might call the executive goals of the political process, efficiency of government and political stability, for example, and so I cannot consider the argument made in some quarters that judicial review threatens those goals, except to observe that history provides little support for that view. But it seems plain that, in the form in which it exists in the United States, judicial review does not offend any symbolic or agency goals. It does not impair equality of vote, because it is a form of districting and does not, in itself, reflect any contempt for or disregard of any group within the community. Nor does judicial review damage the agency goals of democracy. On the contrary, it guards those goals by giving special protection to freedom of speech and to the other liberties that nourish moral agency in politics. It does more. It provides a forum of politics in which citizens may participate argumentatively if they wish, and therefore in a manner more directly connected to their moral lives than voting almost ever is. In this forum, moreover, the leverage of the minorities who have the most negligible leverage in ordinary politics is vastly improved. So constitutionalism seems to do well when tested against the participatory goals of egalitarian politics. It is a crucial question, therefore, whether constitutionalism improves the accuracy of political decisions. If it does, then it would seem, on that ground, to deserve a place in an independent conception of democracy. But here the distinction between choice-sensitive and choice-insensitive issues is particularly important. I have argued elsewhere that it would corrupt rather than promote accuracy if a court enforcing judicial review were to set aside choice-sensitive decisions legislators make. I have also argued that it enhances accuracy when a court reviews certain choice-insensitive decisions of the legislature, namely those that reject putative rights against majority decision. See E.D. Dworkin, A Matter of Principle, Laws Empire. It is these choice-insensitive issues, of course, that the federal courts claim jurisdiction to decide. including the choice-insensitive issues of which issues are choice-insensitive. I will not repeat my arguments here. If my views can be sustained, however, then constitutionalism is an improvement in democracy so long as, but only so long as, its jurisdiction is limited to choice-insensitive issues of principle. 6. Coda. There is much more to be said on this subject, including qualifications of what I have said here, some of which can be found in Freedom's Law and later in this book. But I want, in closing, to emphasize one central theme of this chapter. If a community is genuinely egalitarian in the abstract sense, if it accepts the imperative that a community collectively must treat its members individually with equal concern, then it cannot treat political impact or influence as themselves resources, to be divided according to some metric of equality the way land or raw materials or investments might be divided. Politics, in such a community, is a matter of responsibility, not another dimension of wealth. Et nous avons fini la partie 4. La partie 5, c'est Liberal Community. Ça va de la page 211 à la page 236. Et on aura lu la moitié de ce qui est au programme. Je ne sais pas, je crois. À toutes.